Well, thank you very much for inviting me on this panel, this very distinguished panel. And I really like Justin. I'm going to say Justin instead of Justin. You'll bear with me. Yeah, but we're in America now, so. Yeah. But he really has written an extraordinarily good history. This is a temptation, I think, that both in our blurbs, both EJ and I fell for, is to compare him to previous French observers of the United States. I would not say Tocqueville, because it's very hard to meet that standard. I would also not say Bernard-Henri Lévy, because that's too low a standard. But in fact, there has been a tradition of quite good French writing on contemporary American politics. The book I'd point to is the one by Alain Frachon and Daniel Vernet that was actually published at the time of the Iraq War. Justin's book is much more comprehensive. I mean, he's a serious historian. The other two are basically journalists. And so he's filled in a lot of the gaps and documented in a much more systematic way the history of this movement. And there's a number of reasons why I like it a lot. As Justin said himself, he's made very clear that there is no party line in this movement. And I think he's really paid attention to the complexity of the ideas that have underlined it. One of the early lines of defense of many neoconservatives when they were attacked was to claim that there was no such thing as neoconservatism, and by that I simply think it meant that there were really quite a lot of different ideas feeding this movement, and I think Justin's account of the three different ages is roughly right, and the kind of generational changes that were involved in moving from one to the other. And it makes, I think, very clear that this interpretation that neoconservatism was something like this alien spore that came from Mars and settled on the fertile plains of the United States and then took over the minds of these wholesome Americans is just not right, because in fact most of the tenets of neoconservatism are actually very old ones in the American tradition and in American foreign policy. I just think that the way that they were put together, particularly in the 2000s, was in a way quite unique, but every single one of them had deep roots. Justin mentioned these 5 pillars: internationalism, primacy, militarism, democracy, unilateralism. I think that's, I think you could actually collapse the primacy and militarism into a single pillar. But I think if you look further back at the history of the movement, there's another important pillar that was there right from the beginning and was the essence of the Public Interest magazine, which is what EJ had just alluded to, which was a great skepticism about the prospects for very ambitious social engineering. In addition to the examples that he gave, I'll just cite 2 of the classic books that came out of that. One was James Q. Wilson's Thinking About Crime, in which he explicitly says, and this was in the midst of the great crime wave that began in the mid-1960s, and when he wrote that book finally in the 1980s, he said, look, anybody that thinks that you can deal with crime by getting at root causes like poverty and racism doesn't understand the limits of public policy. What you can do is ameliorate some of the symptoms and manage the problem, but you cannot deal with root causes. One of his ways of managing it was his famous broken windows article that he published with George Kelling in The Atlantic, that actually, it's a article that I've greatly admired as an academic. I wish, I could write something that would have a comparable good effect on the lives of other people, because that's really what, in a sense, laid the basis for the kinds of policing policies that were then carried out after the late 1980s in New York and really led to the renaissance of that city. The other great example, of course, was Charles Murray and the whole argument about, in Falling Behind, about AFDC and the impact of that particular social program on out-of-wedlock childbearing, which ultimately led to the repeal of that law in the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, which ended the modern American welfare system that Bill Clinton signed and passed by a Republican Congress. And both of these, in a sense, these really major developments that came out of that whole school of the public interest were very much in line with this idea that in social policy we frequently get results very different from the ones that we hope for. And so I think that as we began the 2000s, there were actually two very contradictory pillars of thought in the neoconservative movement. The one was that very cautionary one about the use of power, but the other one was one that actually approved and legitimated and to some degree celebrated the positive moral uses of American power. And there wasn't really any forum because these two pillars, in a sense, were discussed by completely different groups of people, one doing domestic policy and the other doing foreign policy. There never was an effort or an opportunity, I think, to try to reconcile what were actually quite contradictory points of view of the opportunities for human agency to manipulate social outcomes. And I think what happened in the 2000s is that the power principle won out over the cautionary principle, and that's what led to the result that we had in advocacy of the Iraq War. Another point that I admired about Justin's book is he was very polite today, but he's also, I think, doesn't let neocons off the hook. And in discussing the movement and the way it evolved in the 2000s, I think, as you can infer from his presentation, there was a shift from a more open-ended intellectual pursuit of ideas towards a more, in a sense, closed-minded advocacy of policies where the ends were not so up for grabs. And he accuses that generation of certain real failings, including, and these are not my words, these are his, intellectual laziness, failure to distinguish, for example, between different Islamist and Middle Eastern groups that were giving us trouble, resort to conspiracy theories linking Al-Qaeda and Iraq, failure to acknowledge the fact that the world had changed and there were now non-state actors that were competing with states as sources of power, failure to understand the complexity of social transformations in distant countries. And his other criticism is one of arrogance, of belief in our ability here in Washington to understand very complex issues that are going on in other parts of the world, and then the failure to invest in the kind of knowledge that would make those kinds of decisions or would temper some of the predictions and beliefs that flowed out of those convictions. And I think this is all fair and needs to be taken to heart. Now, actually, EJ has kind of stolen a little bit of my thunder on what I was going to say about the future of neoconservatism, because I would agree with him completely that, as far as I can see, when neoconservatism first appeared, it was a genuinely new position because it really was universalistic and took aspects of the left-wing agenda, that is to say, universal human rights and a progressive view of the possibility of social change, but coupled it with these cautionary kinds of conservative principles, and that was a mix that really had not existed previously. But I think that in the current incarnation, it's either that there's neoconservatism has just evolved into conservatism, as EJ said, or else that some of those neoconservative ideas have simply become mainstream Republican ideas, and it's much harder to see the difference. Bob Kagan tried to do this a couple of years ago in his book, The Return of History and the End of Dreams. I don't know where he got that title, but in which I think he was trying to outline in a kind of post-hegemonic world where you had a return of big powers like Russia and China, what a distinctively neoconservative foreign policy would look like. I actually don't think it's terribly successful because I think he's actually trying to muscle a very different kind of world back into this old familiar bipolar Cold War framework where you've got democracies on the one hand and authoritarian states on the other. And I just don't think it works because, you know, countries like Brazil and South Africa may be democracies, but they just don't have or India, for that matter, really do not have a natural community of interest with the United States. And therefore, I think you're really dealing with a very different kind of world. I think that there's actually a big missed opportunity with regard to a future neoconservatism. One of the things that I've always thought was a weakness in the movement as a whole was its failure to pay enough attention to economics and to come up with a coherent view. And in a sense, there was, you know, the foundations of this. So Bill's father wrote a book called Two Cheers for Capitalism. Daniel Bell, a long time ago, wrote a book called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And it was clear from a lot of this early writing that many neoconservatives simply did not buy into, you know, Friedrich Hayek and libertarian economics and then the kind of neoclassical paradigm that was dominant on, you know, on the American right. But for one reason or another, you know, there was a merger and an acceptance basically of the Reagan economic agenda of low taxes and supply side and so on and so forth. And it does seem to me, especially after the financial crisis that we've just gone through, that there's actually a big opportunity for rethinking some of those from a you know, some of the, you know, what's happened both to the United States economy and to the global economy from a point of view that doesn't simply, you know, like neoclassical economists look at economics from an extremely reductionist and very ideological point of view, but that takes moral values seriously, that takes community seriously, that takes national interest seriously. And I think that if you know, people had thought through what the real failures of the free market orthodoxy were that we've just experienced, you actually could come up with a very interesting position that would you know, be the equivalent of neoconservative for the era that we are entering into. And again, this would lay the seeds for future conflicts because I think if you thought that through, it would then throw into question the tenet about American primacy, because one of the big you know, challenges we're going to face is that the economic basis for our primacy is fast eroding. So thank you, but congratulations, Justin, on your book, the one by Alain Frachon and Daniel Vernet that was actually published at the time of the Iraq War. Justin's book is much more comprehensive. I mean, he's a serious historian. The other two are basically journalists. And so he's filled in a lot of the gaps and documented in a much more systematic way the history of this movement. And there's a number of reasons why I like it a lot. Meant that there were really quite a lot of different ideas feeding this movement. And I think Justin's account of the three different ages is roughly right, and the kind of generational changes that were involved in moving from one to the other. And it makes, I think, very clear that this interpretation that neoconservatism was something like a, you know, this alien spore that came from Mars and settled, as Justin said himself, he's made very clear that there is no party line in this movement, and I think he's really paid attention to the complexity of the ideas that have underlined it. One of the early lines of defense of many neoconservatives when they were attacked was to claim that there was no such thing as neoconservatism, and by that I simply think it well, thank you very much for inviting me on this panel, this very distinguished panel, and I really like Justin. I'm going to say Justin instead of Justin. You'll bear with me. Yeah, but we're in America now, so. Yeah. But he really has written an extraordinarily good history. This is a temptation, I think, that both in our blurbs, both EJ and I fell for, is to compare him to previous French observers of the United States. I would not say Tocqueville, because it's very hard to meet that standard. I would also not say Bernard-Henri Lévy, because that's too low a standard. But in fact, there has been a tradition of quite good French writing on contemporary American politics. The book I'd point to is